The super empath's detachment that freezes the avoidance ego solid. You ever notice how the moment you stop chasing someone who's been running from love, suddenly they're the ones who can't stop thinking about you? It's like the second your energy pulls away, their ego hits a brick wall. That's not magic. That's what happens when an empath, someone who loves deeply, finally decides, I'm done explaining my worth. For so long, the empath bends, adapts, and forgives, not because they're weak, but because they believe in connection. They think if they love harder, the avoidant will finally feel safe enough to stay. But here's the truths: you can't nurture someone into emotional maturity. When the super empath finally detaches, not in anger, but in peace, that's when the real power shift happens. Because the avoidant has built their identity on control, on being the one who decides when and how the connection happens. But when the empath steps back, when they stop explaining, defending, or waiting, the avoidance ego suddenly loses its oxygen. They go from feeling superior to feeling seen, and that's terrifying. It's not revenge, it's reflection. The empath's silence becomes the mirror where the avoidant must finally face themselves. And in that silence, the empath is free, free to love without losing themselves, free to connect without being consumed, free to walk away, not from the person, but from the pattern. Emotional energy is one of the most underrated currencies in human connection. We talk about time, attention, and affection as though they're separate, but really, they all come down to the same thing: energy. The empath knows this intuitively, even if they can't always articulate it. They feel deeply, they sense moods, silences, and subtle shifts in tone. When they care, they give from a place that is raw and real, but because that energy flows so naturally from them, they often forget that it has value. They forget that what feels easy for them, listening, understanding, being present, is exactly what others crave but rarely give in return. The avoidant, on the other hand, operates on a different frequency. They crave connection but fear what it might demand of them. They want closeness, but on their terms, when it feels safe, when it doesn't expose their vulnerabilities. So they take the empath's energy, the warmth, the reassurance, the effort, and they use it as emotional fuel. Not always maliciously, but as a way to maintain control. The empath's attention becomes their comfort zone, their constant mirror that says, you're safe, you're desired, you're important. But here's the problem: when one person is giving emotional energy and the other is only consuming it, the balance becomes toxic. The empath keeps pouring because they believe love heals all. They think, if I just give a little more understanding, maybe they'll open up, maybe they'll see I'm safe. Yet the more they give, the more the avoidant retreats. Not because the empath did something wrong, but because the avoidance ego feeds on the dynamic of being pursued. It's a pattern built on emotional dependence disguised as independence. The moment the empath realizes their energy has been a currency, everything shifts. They begin to notice how drained they feel after every interaction. They see that their emotional generosity has become the avoidance oxygen. They understand that love isn't supposed to feel like constant emotional labor. So they pull back, not out of spite, but out of self-preservation. The withdrawal of energy isn't loud or dramatic, it's subtle, a calm detachment. The messages stop being instant, the explanations fade. The empath stops performing emotional CPR on a connection that flatlined long ago, and that's when the power dynamic flips. The avoidant, who once felt in control, suddenly feels an emptiness they can't explain. The warmth they took for granted is gone, and with it goes the reflection that validated them. They may not even recognize it as loss at first. It feels like irritation, confusion, even anger. But underneath that is the truth: they were addicted to the emotional energy the empath provided. Without it, they must face themselves. The empath's energy was never ordinary. It was a force that gave meaning, safety, and validation. By withdrawing it, the empath exposes the truth: that emotional currency is not infinite, and that love cannot thrive when it's one-sided. When the giving stops, the illusion breaks, and for the first time, both people must reckon with the real value of emotional investment. Detachment isn't about shutting down or becoming cold. It's about seeing things clearly for the first time. The empath spends so much of their life feeling responsible for the emotions of others. When someone they care about pulls away, they instantly wonder what they did wrong. They analyze every detail: the tone of a message, the pause before a reply, the shift in body language, trying to figure out how to fix it. For the empath, love and responsibility often become tangled. They think caring means carrying, so they absorb, they overthink, and they give until there's nothing left to give. But detachment changes everything. It's not an act of rejection, it's the reclaiming of perspective. When the empath detaches, they stop trying to interpret every silence as a verdict on their worth. They stop searching for meaning in the avoidant's mixed signals. They no longer feel compelled to explain or prove why they deserve to be chosen. Instead, they begin to observe the relationship from a distance, not with bitterness, but with a quiet kind of awareness. This is the shift from emotional reactivity to emotional clarity. Clarity shows the empath what they could never see when they were drowning in effort. They start to notice that the relationship was often sustained by their hope, not by mutual investment. They realize how much energy went into maintaining peace rather than experiencing joy. Detachment allows them to look at the pattern without defending it. They can finally admit, it's not that they didn't understand my love, it's that they weren't ready to receive it. That understanding frees them from the loop of over, giving and under receiving. When an empath is attached, they operate from emotion. When they detach, they operate from truth. The truth is that love can't be built on imbalance. The truth is that someone else's avoidance is not an invitation to try harder. It's a signal to step back. Detachment gives the empath the strength to let silence exist without rushing to fill it, to let someone's distance remain without chasing it, to let unanswered questions stay unanswered. It's the act of trusting that peace is found not in controlling outcomes, but in accepting reality. To the avoidant, this new calm feels unfamiliar. They're used to the empath's energy orbiting around them, soothing their insecurities, softening their edges. When that presence becomes still, the avoidant is left with only their own reflection, and that reflection is often uncomfortable. But to the empath, that stillness feels like coming home. It's the space where they can hear themselves again, where their self-worth stops depending on whether someone else chooses to stay. Clarity replaces chaos. What once felt like rejection now feels like redirection. What once felt like silence now feels like serenity. The empath begins to see that emotional detachment doesn't make them less loving. It makes their love cleaner, freer, and more grounded. They stop giving from fear and start choosing from strength. They no longer chase understanding, they embody it. And in doing so, they transform what was once an exhausting cycle into a state of balance. One where they finally recognize that detachment was never the end of love, but the beginning of self-respect. The avoidance ego thrives on control because control is the only thing that feels safe to them. Deep down, the avoidant fears emotional exposure. To be seen, to be known, to be depended on, those things feel like traps rather than bonds. So they build walls that look like independence. They tell themselves they don't need anyone, that closeness is suffocating, that solitude is strength. But beneath that surface is a quiet truth: avoidance is not freedom, it's fear disguised as autonomy. Their ego depends on maintaining the illusion that they are always the one in charge of emotional distance. When they meet an empath, something fascinating happens. The empath's depth draws them in, but it also threatens them. The empath's warmth feels like both comfort and danger because it reaches into places the avoidant has carefully locked away. In the beginning, the avoidant enjoys the attention. The empath's understanding feels like validation, the kind they rarely allow themselves to feel. But as intimacy grows, the avoidant begins to pull back. They start creating space. Not because they don't care, but because caring too much activates old fears of losing control, of being consumed, of being vulnerable. The avoidant's ego relies on emotional equilibrium that favors them. As long as they can decide when connection happens, they feel secure. As long as the empath keeps reaching out, they remain in the position of power. The dynamic becomes a dance of pursuit and retreat. The empath giving, the avoidant rationing affection in small doses to keep the connection alive, but never too close. It's not always conscious manipulation. Often it's survival instinct. The avoidant's ego equates control with safety. The empath's emotional consistency feels like a risk because it demands reciprocity, and reciprocity feels like surrender. But when the empath finally stops reaching, the entire system collapses. The ego that once felt secure starts to panic. Suddenly, the avoidant has nothing to control, nothing to withhold, nothing to retreat from. The silence that follows their distancing isn't filled with the empath's reassurance anymore. It's filled with their own self-reflection, and that's far more confronting. The absence of pursuit forces them to face the emotional void they've been avoiding. For the first time, they're no longer reacting to someone else's energy. They're left alone with their own. That loss of control exposes something fragile. The ego that thrived on power now feels powerless. They start replaying moments in their head, trying to understand why the empath no longer responds the way they used to. They feel the discomfort of realizing that the connection was never truly under their control. It was sustained by the empath's willingness to engage. The moment that willingness disappears, the avoidant sense of superiority melts into confusion and even regret. In truth, the avoidant never feared the empath. They feared what the empath reflected, the vulnerability they've spent their life running from. When the empath detaches, it's like holding up a mirror that shows the avoidant exactly what they've been hiding: their need for love, their fear of it, and their inability to balance the two. Without control, the ego has no protection, and in that stillness, the avoidant is finally confronted with the one thing they've avoided most: themselves. Silence has a language of its own, and it often speaks louder than any attempt to explain, justify, or convince. For the empath, silence used to feel unbearable. They've spent years believing that communication could fix anything, that if they could just express their love clearly enough, show their intentions gently enough, or explain their pain softly enough, the avoidant would finally understand. But words are only powerful when they are met with willingness. When they are met with resistance, those same words turn into noise, echoes that never land. So, when the empath finally stops speaking, it isn't because they've run out of things to say. It's because they've realized that silence carries the message their words never could. The empath's silence isn't passive aggression, it's power reclaimed. It's a boundary drawn without needing to announce it. When they stop reaching out, stop over-explaining. Stop filling the void with apologies that don't belong to them. Something profound happens. The dynamic shifts. The avoidant, who once felt comfortably in control, now faces a silence that doesn't chase, doesn't beg, and doesn't seek reassurance. That silence becomes unsettling because it disrupts the script they've always known, one where the empath tries and they decide. For the empath, this silence is not emptiness, it's liberation. It's the quiet after the storm, the moment when emotional noise fades and peace begins to take shape. Silence allows them to hear their own voice again, a voice that was buried under constant explanations and emotional negotiation. In the quiet, they begin to realize how much energy was spent trying to be understood by someone who was never truly listening. The absence of words becomes self-protection. It's not about punishing the avoidant, it's about protecting the empath's sanity. To the avoidant, this silence lands differently. They were used to the empath's presence as a constant hum in the background of their emotional life. Always available, always forgiving, always trying. When that hum stops, the void feels strange and disorienting. The avoidance ego, which once felt safe behind distance, begins to feel threatened by the lack of attention. The silence mirrors back their own avoidance. It says, you can't control what you no longer have access to. It forces them to confront the emptiness they used to cover up with avoidance. What the empath discovers through silence is that peace isn't found in the other person's response. It's found in their own restraint. Every time they resist the urge to reach out, they strengthen their emotional boundaries. Every quiet moment becomes a reminder that love doesn't need to be proven through persistence. Silence teaches them to let go of outcomes, to trust that clarity doesn't always come through words, and that dignity sometimes looks like saying nothing at all. In a world that constantly pushes for reaction, silence becomes the empath's revolution. It's the end of performing emotional labor for someone unwilling to meet them halfway. It's the moment when they stop trying to be understood and start understanding themselves. And as the avoidant stands before that silence, stripped of validation and control, they finally come face to face with the weight of their own behavior. A truth that no conversation could have ever delivered so clearly. Freedom is what the empath discovers at the end of the long, exhausting road of over-giving. It doesn't arrive all at once. It comes quietly, like a deep breath after years of holding it in. For so long, the empath has mistaken endurance for love. They believed that staying meant strength, that understanding someone's wounds meant healing them, that patience would eventually be rewarded with reciprocity. But love that requires you to shrink, to silence your needs, or to constantly chase reassurance isn't love, it's survival disguised as devotion. The moment the empath understands this truth, detachment transforms into liberation. Freedom for the empath doesn't mean they stop feeling. It means they stop confusing compassion with self-sacrifice. They begin to see that walking away isn't giving up on love. It's giving up on trying to earn what should be freely given. This freedom is not loud or rebellious. It's peaceful. It's the quiet realization that they can still love someone and choose not to lose themselves in the process. It's the understanding that their worth doesn't depend on whether the avoidant ever sees it. For the avoidant, this freedom looks different. When the empath detaches, the avoidant is forced to confront the hollow comfort they've built around control. The silence that once served them now becomes a mirror reflecting their own fear of intimacy. The ego that thrived on distance starts to crumble because there's no longer anyone reaching across the gap to keep the illusion alive. The empath's detachment exposes a truth the avoidant has long avoided. You can't feel secure by keeping love at arm's length. Freedom for the avoidant would mean learning to sit with vulnerability instead of fleeing from it. But that lesson often comes too late. For the empath, this new sense of freedom feels like emotional sobriety. They stop confusing chaos for passion. They no longer mistake emotional highs and lows for depth. Instead, they start to crave stability. Not the kind that depends on someone else's moods, but the kind that comes from within. They learn that love doesn't have to hurt to be real. They no longer chase the avoidant's approval because they realize their peace is worth more than someone else's validation. Freedom also means forgiveness, not for the other person, but for themselves. The empath forgives the version of themselves who stayed too long, who loved too hard, who kept hoping someone would change. They understand that their sensitivity wasn't the problem, it was their direction. They gave their empathy to someone who wasn't ready to receive it, and now they're learning to give it to themselves. They start setting boundaries not as walls, but as gates, allowing in what feels reciprocal and closing out what drains their spirit. This kind of freedom feels like standing in the sunlight after living too long in the shade of someone else's fears. It's the moment when the empath no longer needs closure, explanation, or recognition. They are whole again, not because someone finally stayed, but because they finally stopped abandoning themselves. In that wholeness, love transforms from a battlefield into a garden, and in that garden, the empath realizes that the freedom they found in detachment was never about escaping anyone else. It was about finally coming home to themselves. When the empath finally detaches, it's not a moment of revenge, it's a moment of awakening. It's that quiet realization that love was never meant to be a tug of war between the one who feels deeply and the one who fears deeply. It's understanding that you can't teach someone to meet you emotionally, they have to choose to meet you there. Detachment doesn't mean the empath stopped caring, it means they finally started caring about themselves too. The beauty of this transformation lies in its stillness. There's no dramatic exit, no grand confrontation, just a shift in energy so powerful it changes everything. The empath stops running after explanations and begins walking toward peace. They stop trying to heal others and start honoring their own healing. That's the moment the entire dynamic dissolves. The avoidant loses control, not because the empath took it, but because they no longer need it. And in that silence, the kind that used to hurt, something incredible happens. The empath realizes they were never asking for too much. They were simply asking the wrong person. They discover that love, in its purest form, doesn't require begging, chasing, or proving. It flows naturally, effortlessly, mutually. The empath's detachment becomes an act of truth, the kind of truth that doesn't need validation because it stands firmly on self-respect. To every empath listening, your peace is not negotiable. You were never meant to carry love like a burden. The ones who truly see you will never make you question your worth, and the ones who do are simply chapters, lessons dressed as love. Detachment is not losing, it's choosing. Choosing to release the patterns that drained you. Choosing to protect your energy. Choosing yourself, not out of ego, but out of love for the person you've always been beneath the exhaustion. So walk away, not bitter, but better. Walk away knowing that silence can speak louder than any apology, and that freedom is the most loving thing you can ever give yourself. When you let go, you make space. Space for peace, for clarity, and for the kind of love that doesn't require you to lose yourself, to feel seen. Thank you for listening, for feeling, and for showing up, not just to this message, but to your own truth. Remember, you don't have to dim your light to be loved. The right hearts won't be blinded by it, they'll be guided by it. Take this as your reminder that detachment isn't the end of love. It's the beginning of self-love. Thank you, and take care of your energy, because that's where your power truly lies.